The job listing didn't even have a company name on it. Just a phone number, a part-time hourly rate that was about $2 more than I expected, and 4 words: night attendant, historic grounds. I almost scrolled past it. I'd been applying to anything within driving distance for 3 weeks by then. And most of the listings that paid like that wanted forklift certs or a clean commercial license, neither of which I had. But the rate stuck in my head. $2 an hour over a 40-hour week is the difference between catching up on the truck payment and not. So I called. A man answered on the second ring. He didn't say a business name, just, yeah, like I'd interrupted something. I told him I was calling about the night attendant position. There was a pause where I could hear a television in the background, some kind of game show. And then he asked if I could pass a background check, and if I had a problem being alone. I said yes to the first and no to the second. He told me to come to the property Thursday at 6 in the evening, and not before, because the day woman left at 5:30, and he liked there to be a gap. I didn't know what he meant by a gap. I wrote down the address, and that was the whole interview. I should explain where I was at the time, because it matters for understanding why I didn't ask more questions. My name's Dale. I was 41 that winter, divorced 2 years, living in a rented half of a duplex with a water heater that took 20 minutes to produce anything you'd call warm. I'd been a parts driver for a regional auto supply chain for 9 years, and then the chain got bought by a bigger chain, and the bigger chain consolidated the routes, and I got a letter thanking me for my service. I had maybe 6 weeks of cushion left when I made that call, and most of that cushion was a credit card I was trying not to think about. So when a stranger offered me night work at a good rate and didn't seem to care about my gap in employment, I wasn't in a position to interrogate him about what a gap between shifts was supposed to accomplish. The address took me out past the edge of town, onto a county road that ran along a creek, and then up a private drive marked with a single sign that said, Bellevon Estate Preserved Property, in white letters on green, the kind of sign a parks department uses. The drive was longer than I expected, maybe a third of a mile of gravel under bare oaks. And at the end of it, the trees opened up, and there was the house. I'd grown up 40 minutes from there and never knew it existed. It was big in a way that old money is big. 3 stories of gray stone with a slate roof and tall windows, a wraparound porch, a carriage house off to the side that had been turned into something with a modern door. Floodlights on the corners of the roof threw everything into hard white and long shadow. It was beautiful, and it was cold. And the gravel lot in front held exactly 2 vehicles, a county-looking sedan and an old brown pickup. The man from the phone was leaning against the pickup. He was older than he'd sounded, maybe 65, in a canvas jacket with a thermos in one hand. He introduced himself as Marv and shook my hand once, hard, and looked at me the way you look at a used appliance you're deciding whether to buy. Then he said, "You're not Jumpy, are you? I can't use Jumpy out here." I told him I'd done overnight stocking. I was used to empty buildings. He nodded like that was an acceptable answer and told me to follow him in. The inside of Bellevon was a museum, more or less. Marv explained as we walked that the estate had been deeded to a private historical trust back in the 70s when the last of the family died off. And the trust ran it as a house museum, guided tours in summer, school groups in fall, a gift counter selling postcards and little jars of local honey. The day staff handled all of that. My job was the night, and the night job was simple, he said. Walk the rounds, check the doors, keep the climate logs. Make sure the heat stayed in the range the trust required for the artifacts, because old paper and old fabric crack if the air gets too dry, and they bloom mold if it gets too wet. And, he said, almost as an afterthought, keep the visitor log. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to keep at night, when there were no visitors. I didn't say so. He took me through the main floor first. The rooms were roped off with those brass stanchions and velvet cords. Furniture staged like the family had just stepped out. A long dining table set for 12 with real-looking but probably reproduction china. The air in there smelled like furniture wax and cold stone, and underneath that, something older and drier. The smell of a place that's heated by old radiators that bake the dust. Marv walked fast for a man his age, narrating in a flat voice he'd clearly used 1,000 times for tours, except his version had warnings folded into it. This sconce sticks, don't force it. This floorboard by the window dips, step over it. This door to the back stairs, you keep it shut, always, day or night, because the trust says the back stairs aren't part of the tour and the day staff gets sloppy about it. We ended up in a small room off the front entry that had clearly been the original receiving room and was now the office. There was a desk, a space heater, a coffee maker on a filing cabinet, a wall of binders, and a guest book. Not a computer guest book, an actual leather-bound register, the kind you sign at a wedding, open on a wooden stand with a pen on a little chain. Marv tapped the open page. "This is the log," he said. "Day staff sign their visitors in here. Numbers mostly. School group of 30, you write 30. Walk-ins, you count heads. End of the night, before you leave, you total the day's column, and you write the total at the bottom, and you initial it. That's it." I looked at the page. It was ruled in columns: date, time, party name, number, and party. The day's entries were in a few different hands, some neat, some scrawled. A Mrs. Holloway, party of 4, 10:15. A school group, party of 26, 11 o'clock. A couple of walk-ins in the afternoon. It looked completely mundane. I asked Marv why the night attendant needed to total it instead of the day staff, who actually saw the people. He didn't quite answer. He said the trust wanted the totals done after hours, by someone who hadn't been on the floor, as a kind of check. Independent count, he called it. Then he said the thing that I keep coming back to now, in the same flat tour guide voice he'd used for the sticking sconce. "You total what's on the page," he said. "Not what you think should be there. You don't add. You don't subtract. If the page says a number, the number's real. You write down the sum, and you go home." At the time, it sounded like every other anal retentive rule a museum job comes with. Don't touch the artifacts, don't prop the doors, don't improvise the count. I'd worked retail. I'd had managers lecture me about the right way to face shampoo bottles. A man telling me to add up a column without editorializing did not register as strange. I said sure. He looked at me for a second longer than the comment deserved, then moved on to the thermostats. The training took about 2 hours. He showed me the climate panel, an ugly beige box from probably the 90s with a digital readout, and the paper log where I was to write the temperature and humidity every 2 hours on my rounds. He showed me the rounds route, a specific order through the rooms that the trust had laid out, marked on a laminated card I was to carry. The order didn't make obvious sense. It doubled back on itself, made you cross the main hall twice, but Marv said to follow it exactly, because the day staff had gotten lazy and started cutting corners, and the trust had complained about gaps in the log. Gaps again. He used that word a lot. He showed me the breaker panel, the fire pull stations, the first aid kit, the landline phone that was the only phone, because cell service out there was 1 bar on a good night. He showed me the bathroom I could use and the one I couldn't because it was original to the house and roped off. He showed me the coffee, which was a can of the cheapest store brand, and apologized for it in a way that suggested he drank it too. The only part of the orientation that snagged on me, beyond the log rule, was the front door. Bellevon had a heavy original front door, oak with iron hardware, and a modern deadbolt that had been retrofitted into it. Marv told me that at closing, after the day woman left, I was to throw the deadbolt and leave it thrown all night. Standard. But then he said that if I heard knocking after midnight, I was not to open the door. Not to look through the sidelight glass, not to call out, not to answer. Just note the time in the margin of the log and keep doing my rounds. I asked, reasonably, what if it was somebody who needed help? A broken down car, somebody lost on the county road. Marv took a sip from his thermos and said, "There's a sign at the bottom of the drive says the property's closed at night. Anybody at the door after midnight passed that sign to get up here. The trust's position is, that's not your problem to solve. You note the time and you let it be. If it's still going on at 2, you can call the number on the card and somebody'll handle it." He paused. "It mostly doesn't get to 2. I didn't like that. But I also wasn't going to argue myself out of a job on day 1 over a hypothetical. People knock on the wrong doors all the time out in the county. Hunters, drunk teenagers, somebody who took the private drive thinking it was a road. Letting a stranger into an empty mansion full of valuables at 1 in the morning was a bad idea regardless of any rule. And I told myself that's all the rule was: liability insurance. A way to keep some underpaid night guy from getting robbed or sued. That's the thing about rules at a new job. You read your own reasonable explanation into them, because the alternative is that they don't have a reasonable explanation. And on your first night, you can't afford to think that. Marv left a little after 8. He told me he'd be back the next 2 nights to ride along until I had the rounds down. And after that, I'd be solo, with him on call. He said the day woman's name was Pam, and I'd probably never meet her because of the gap. But if I needed to leave her a note, there was a pad by the office phone. He shook my hand again, told me the coffee was terrible but the heater in the office worked, and walked out into the floodlights. I heard his truck crunch down the gravel, and then it was just me in the house and the radiators ticking. That first night I did the rounds maybe twice as carefully as I needed to. I followed the laminated card exactly, doubling back across the hall like it told me, writing the temperature in the climate log every 2 hours, 66 degrees, 41% humidity, both inside the range Marv had circled in red on the panel. The house at night was loud in the way old houses are loud. The radiators knocked. The slate roof pinged when the temperature dropped outside. The big windows flexed in the wind with a sound like someone pressing their palm against the glass. I jumped at exactly none of it, which I was proud of, and which I now think was just ignorance. Around 11, I did the thing I'd been told to do at the end of the night, even though it wasn't the end of the night, because I wanted to make sure I understood it. I went to the office and totaled the visitor log. I added up the number column for the day. 4, 26, 2, 3, a few more. It came to 51. I wrote 51 at the bottom of the day's column, initialed it DM, and felt vaguely satisfied, the way you do when you complete even a pointless task correctly. Then I went back out and finished my rounds and read a paperback at the office desk until my shift ended at 6 in the morning, when the gravel out front lit up with headlights and Marv's truck pulled in to relieve me. He looked at the climate log, nodded, looked at the visitor log, and nodded again. He didn't double-check my math. He just said, "Good. Same time tomorrow." And I drove home in the gray light and slept until 2 in the afternoon. That was the rhythm for about a week and a half. And it was, genuinely, the easiest money I'd ever made. I'd show up at 6, Marv would already be gone or about to go. The house would be warm and quiet. And I'd walk my loops and write my numbers and total the log and read my books. I got through 3 paperbacks. I started bringing my own coffee in a thermos because the canned stuff really was that bad. I texted my ex-wife that I'd found work because we still had to coordinate about the car insurance. And she said good. And that was as warm as we got those days. I told myself I'd gotten lucky for once. A boring job is a gift when your alternative is no job. The first thing that didn't fit, I almost didn't notice. And when I noticed it, I had an explanation ready before I'd even finished seeing it. It was the totals. I'd been initialing the bottom of the visitor log every night. And one slow stretch around 3 in the morning, I got curious and flipped back through the register to see how far the thing went. It was an old book, mostly full, going back I'd guess 2 or 3 years. And as I paged through it, I started reading the daily totals at the bottom of each column. The way you read anything when you're bored and looking for patterns. Most days were what you'd expect for a small house museum out in the county. 40 here, 60 there, a big day of 110 when there must have been some event, a slow Tuesday of 9. Normal, human. But every so often the total at the bottom didn't match the column above it. I noticed it first on a page from the previous spring. The number entries added up. I did it in my head twice to 38. The total written and initialed at the bottom said 39. One off. I figured somebody fat-fingered the addition. People do it all the time. That's literally why Marv said the trust wanted an independent night count. So the night attendant before me had miscounted by 1. Fine. Except a few pages later, there was another one. Column added to 52. Total said 54. 2 off. And the off totals were always high. The written total was always equal to or greater than the real sum of the column, never less. I flipped faster, scanning just for mismatches, and I found maybe a dozen of them across the last year of the book. All of them initialed with the same letters, all of them off by 1 or 2 or 3, always in the direction of more. Now, here's where I want to be honest about myself, because this is the part where a smarter or less broke man might have started asking questions. I told myself the night guy before me had been padding the numbers. Museums get funding based on attendance. A trust wants to show its donors that people come to the house. If you're a night attendant being paid to total a column, and you know your boss wants the numbers to look healthy, maybe you round up a little. Add a phantom visitor or 2 on the slow days. Nobody checks. It's harmless. It's the kind of small dishonesty that keeps an underfunded place limping along, and it's not my business. That's what I decided I was looking at. A previous attendant cooking the attendants to please the trust. I even felt a little smug about it, like I'd figured out the angle of the job. I closed the book and finished my rounds, and didn't write 53 when the column said 51. I wrote 51 because Marv had told me to write what was on the page, and not what I thought should be there. And now I understood that rule too. It was the trust's clumsy way of telling the night guy to stop padding the numbers. Independent count. Don't add. The rule had a reasonable explanation, see? I was good at finding reasonable explanations. It's a survival skill when you can't afford for things to be unreasonable. The next thing happened maybe 2 nights later. And it was so small that describing it makes it sound like nothing. It was a smell. On my second round of the night, the one that took me through the back of the main floor toward the door to the off-limits back stairs, I caught a smell that didn't belong. The house had its smell, the wax and stone and dry radiator dust, and I'd gotten so used to it I didn't notice it anymore. But that night, in the hall by the backstairs door, there was something on top of it. Wet wool, cold rain on a coat, the specific smell of a person who has just come in out of bad weather, even though it hadn't rained in a week and the door to the back stairs was shut and locked. exactly like it was supposed to be. I stood there with my flashlight and breathed it in and tried to source it. I checked the door locked, knob cold. I checked the windows in the nearby rooms, shut, latched. I went down the route a little further and the smell faded. And when I came back around in my next loop 40 minutes later, it was gone entirely. And the hall just smelled like the house again. Old buildings do weird things with air. They have drafts you can't trace, pockets where smells pool and release. I'd worked in a warehouse that randomly smelled like cut grass in the middle of January, and nobody ever explained it. So I wrote it off. I didn't even note it in the log, because there was no column for smelled like a wet coat by the locked door. And because noting it would have meant treating it as real, and I wasn't ready to do that for a smell. But I started after that, paying a little more attention to the backstairs door. Not because I believed anything, just because it was the one thing Marv had been most firm about: keep it shut. Always in a rule you're told twice has a way of drawing your eye. Marv came by less and less. After the first 3 nights, he stopped riding along. And after the first week, he stopped coming in at 6 to relieve me, instead just rolling up the drive, waiting in his truck until he saw the office light, and pulling away once he knew I'd shown. We'd overlap maybe once a week, when he came in to swap out the climate log binder or restock the terrible coffee. On one of those mornings, I tried, carefully, to bring up the totals. I said something casual like, "Hey, I noticed some of the old totals in the register don't add up to the columns. You want me to flag those or anything?" I was half fishing to see if he'd confirm my padding theory. He didn't. He went still in a way that I noticed at the time and dismissed, and have not been able to dismiss since. He set down the coffee can he was holding and asked me, very evenly, whether I had changed any of the old totals. I said no, of course not. I just noticed them. He said, "Good. Leave the old pages alone. Those are closed out. The trust doesn't want anybody going back and reconciling old pages." He said the word reconciling like it was a swear. Then he picked the coffee can back up and said in his normal voice that the previous guys weren't always careful with their math, and the trust knew that, and it was fine. Just total my own pages, right? And don't touch theirs. Which lined right up with my padding theory, which is why I let it go. But the stillness stayed with me. I'd asked a man about a column of numbers, and for a second he'd looked like I'd asked him about a body. I want to tell you about the previous guys, because they came up more than once, and each time a little differently. Marv referred to the previous guys, or the last few plural, never with names, and never said why there had been several. For a job this easy and this well paid, in an area with this little work, you'd expect turnover to be low. People hang on to easy money. But the impression I built, from the worn-in state of the paperbacks somebody had left in the office desk drawer, from 3 different mug rings burned into the desk's finish, from the layers of initials in the climate logs going back through binder after binder, was that a lot of men had sat in this chair, and not for very long each. I found, in the back of the bottom desk drawer, under a dead flashlight, and a church key and a sleeve of saltines gone soft. A small spiral notebook that wasn't a trust document. Personal. Somebody's own notebook. Most of it was grocery lists and phone numbers and the kind of doodling you do at 3 in the morning. But a few pages in tight ballpoint, somebody had written notes to himself about the job. And I read them the way you read a stranger's diary, fast and a little ashamed. Most of it was mundane. Ask Marv about OT. Pam left the back hall light on again, told her notepad. Radiator in green room knocks bad after 2. Normal. Normal stuff. A guy figuring out a new job, the same things I'd figured out. But near the end of his entries, the tone changed, and I read these parts more than once. Total was 44. Column was 44. Wrote 44. Good night. That one struck me because it was the only entry about the totals, and it had this relieved quality, like matching had been in doubt. Why would you write down that the total matched the column unless sometimes it didn't, in a way that wasn't just bad arithmetic? And then, 2 pages later, the last real entry, dated nothing, just floating there. Don't total it if you didn't watch the whole day. You didn't watch the whole day. You never watched the whole day. That's the point of the gap. Make Pam initial her own count before she leaves. Make her. If the column's already got a total on it when you get here, do not add your own. Walk out. I mean it. Walk out and call Marv from home. Underneath that, in different pressed harder ink, like he'd come back to it later. He won't pick up at night. Nobody picks up at night. That was the last thing written in the notebook. The rest of the pages were blank. I sat with that notebook in the office for a long time, the space heater ticking, my own thermos coffee going cold. I want to describe my actual reaction honestly, because it wasn't fear, not yet. It was something closer to embarrassment on the guy's behalf. The writing had that quality that very tired, very lonely people get when they've been alone on a night shift too long, where small things calcify into rules and rituals, and the rituals start to sound paranoid. I'd felt the edge of it myself, the way the doubling back rounds route had started to feel meaningful, the way I'd started watching the backstairs door. Night work does that. It makes you superstitious about your own routines. I figured this guy had spooked himself, built a little private mythology about the visitor log, and probably that's why the previous guys never lasted. The job was so quiet and so solitary that people's minds turned on them and they quit. That was my read. A reasonable explanation. I was good at those. But I noticed I didn't put the notebook back in the drawer. I put it in my jacket pocket. And on my rounds that night, I caught myself doing the math on the day's column before I was supposed to, just to confirm it matched. And feeling that same small relief the notebook guy had written about when it did. Column of 47, sum of 47. I wrote 47. Good night. And I hated, a little, that I'd let a stranger's spiral notebook get into my head enough that the matching mattered to me now. Here is where I have to tell you about Pam. Even though Marv had said I'd probably never meet her because of the gap. I never did meet her in person. But I started to notice her, the way you notice a coworker you share a desk with on opposite shifts. Her handwriting in the visitor log, round and careful. Her notes on the pad by the phone, always polite, always ending with a little drawn flower. High night shift green room radiator banging again. I put in a maintenance request, sorry. Pam. She left half a sleeve of cookies in the drawer once with a note that said, "For whoever's here tonight, I made too many." She seemed, from these traces, like a genuinely nice woman. The kind who'd worked at the same small place for years and treated the building like hers and the night staff like family she'd never met. I started leaving her notes back. Thanks for the cookies. Radiator's still banging. Sorry, not my department. Small things. It was nice, honestly, to have even a one-way coworker. And then one morning, her note on the pad said something that stopped me with my jacket half on, ready to leave. High night shift weird question. Did you total Tuesday? The book says I had a group of 30, but I only had 12 all day. The school canceled. I crossed it out and wrote 12, but the total at the bottom still says 30-something in your handwriting. Did you change my number? Not mad, just confused. Pam. I went and looked at the book. I went straight to Tuesday. And there it was. A party entry, school group, party of 30, in Pam's round, careful hand. and then a line struck cleanly through the 30 and 12 written above it, also in Pam's hand, with a little note in the margin. Cancelled, only 12 walk-ins, see Pam. And at the bottom of the column, the day's total, in handwriting that I will swear to you was mine, the same slant, the same way I make my threes, totaling the column as if the 30 were still there. 34, initial DM. I did not write 34 on Tuesday. I want to be careful here, because memory is the whole problem. And I knew even in that moment that memory was the problem. I had worked Tuesday. I remembered Tuesday only as another quiet night. I did not remember the totaling specifically, because I'd totaled a column every single night for 2 weeks, and the nights had blurred. It's entirely possible. I told myself this standing right there in the office with my heart going, that I had totaled the column before Pam crossed out the 30, that her cancellation had come in late, that she'd written 30 during the day, that I'd totaled it that night with the 30 still standing, and that she'd come in Wednesday morning, remembered the school canceled, and crossed it out after the fact, leaving my honest total stranded above her honest correction. That's a clean explanation. 2 people doing their jobs at different times, a number changing between them. It happens. Except the note on the pad was dated that morning, and the crossing out in the book was clearly old. The ink had that settled, dried look, and Pam's marginal note said cancelled, like she'd written it the same day during her shift in daylight. And if she'd crossed it out during the day, then when I came in that night, the column would have already said 12, and I would have totaled 12 plus the walk-ins. And the bottom of the page would say something in the 20s, not 34. For the bottom to say 34, I'd have had to total a 30 that by the time I sat down to total it, was already crossed out and corrected to 12 right there on the page in front of me. I'd have had to add a number that had a line through it, look at a 12 and write down 30. And the notebook guy's voice came back to me, the pressed hard ink. You total what's on the page, not what you think should be there. If the page says a number, the number's real. I'd read that as a rule against padding. Don't inflate the count. But standing there over Pam's crossed out 30, I heard it the other way for the first time, and the other way made my mouth go dry. If the page says a number, the number's real. Not the number is true. Not the number is correct. Real. As in, it happened. As in, writing it down made it so, and crossing it out did not unmake it. And the night attendant's job was not to count the people who came, but to confirm the people the book said came. And there was a difference, and the difference was the whole job. And every man who'd sat in this chair before me had eventually understood the difference, and that's why they didn't last. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's hindsight talking, the shape I can see now. In the actual moment I just stood there feeling stupid and unsettled, and told myself, again, the clean version. Late cancellation, stranded total, Pam confused, no big deal. I wrote her a note back. Hi, Pam. Must have totaled it before you crossed it out. Timing thing. Sorry for the confusion. I'll be more careful matching your corrections. Dale. Polite, reasonable. A man covering an embarrassing arithmetic mistake. I drew a little check mark next to my name because she always drew her flower, and it felt rude not to draw something. But I took the spiral notebook out of my jacket that morning before I left, and I flipped to the entry that said, "Don't total it if you didn't watch the whole day." And I read it maybe 5 times, and then I did something I'm not proud of, and that I think the notebook guy would have understood completely. I didn't quit. I didn't call Marv. I told myself I'd just watch more carefully. I'd match Pam's corrections. I'd total only what was truly on the page at the moment I sat down. I'd be the careful one, the one who finally did the job right, and the strangeness would resolve into ordinary bad record keeping. And I'd keep the easy money and the $2 extra an hour. And in a couple of months, I'd have caught up on the truck and maybe even chipped at the card. That was the deal I made with myself at 6 in the morning in that office. I want you to understand, it wasn't bravery, and it wasn't even really curiosity. It was the truck payment. It was the card. It was 6 weeks of cushion that had become 4. A man with 4 weeks of cushion does not walk out on a job because a column of numbers won't sit still. The thing about deciding to watch more carefully is that it works. You start seeing things you'd trained yourself not to see. Over the next week, I matched every correction. I waited until I sat down at night, and I read the day's columns slowly, accounting for every cross-out, every margin note, every canceled and no-show. And I totaled only the live numbers, the ones standing, and I initialed it, and I checked it twice. And for 4 nights, it was clean. Column matched my total because I made it match. I felt better. I started to think Pam's Tuesday had been a fluke, a one-time stranding, and that the off totals in the old pages really were just sloppy arithmetic by tired men, nothing more. On the 5th night, the column wouldn't add up. Not in the way you're thinking. I added it 3 times and got the same honest sum, each time 33. 33 real people, accounting for 2 crossouts and a no-show. I wrote 33 at the bottom, clean, initialed it, sat back. And then, because the notebook had made me paranoid, I read back up the column one more time, slowly, name by name, and I found a party I had not seen the first 3 times I added it. It was there in the list, between the school group and the afternoon walk-ins, in handwriting that was not Pam's round, careful hand, and was not mine, and was not any of the day staff scrawls I'd come to recognize. Pressed light, almost dry, like a pen running out. Party name, just a dash, a single horizontal line where a name should be. Time, 1:40. Number in party, 1, 1:40. There were no tours at 1:40 in the morning. The day staff left at 5:30 in the afternoon. The gap. The thing Marv liked about the gap. The reason he wanted a space between Pam leaving and me arriving. The reason the nightman totals a day he didn't watch. I sat there and I looked at that entry, and I did the only thing my training had given me. I added it in. 33 plus 1. I crossed out my 33 and wrote 34 and initialed it, because the page said a number, and Marv had told me the number on the page was real, and the notebook guy had told me you total what's on the page, and not what you think should be there. My hand did it almost before I decided to. And the second the ink was down, I understood that I had just written into the book that one person, with no name, came to a closed museum alone at 1:40 in the morning. And that by writing it, I'd agreed that it was real. The same way somebody, some night, had agreed that 30 canceled school children were real. The same way a dozen tired men across 2 years had been agreeing to numbers that didn't match the day, and that the off totals in the old pages weren't padding at all. They were nights like this one. They were the gap getting written down. I should have walked out. The notebook said, walk out. Instead, I did my rounds, because it was time for my rounds, and routine is the last thing to go. And on the round that takes me through the back of the main floor toward the off-limits door, the wet wool smell was there again. Cold rain on a coat, thick this time, and under it now, something I hadn't smelled before. Fainter, the copper and salt smell of a person who has been outside in the cold for a long time and bleeding a little, the smell of the inside of an ambulance. And the door to the back stairs, the one Marv had told me twice to keep shut always, day or night, the one I had checked at the start of my shift and found locked with a cold knob. was standing open 4 inches onto a black stairwell. And from down inside it, below me, under the house, I could hear, very faint and very patient, somebody writing. I want to say I went down those stairs. It would make me a different kind of man in this story if I had. I didn't. I stood at the top of that black stairwell with my flashlight in my hand, and I listened to the sound. And the sound was exactly what I told you. It was somebody writing. Not scratching, not dragging. The specific rhythm of a person filling in a form. A short stroke, a pause, a longer stroke, a pause. The sound a pen makes when whoever's holding it knows the columns by heart and doesn't have to think about where the next mark goes. I reached out and I pulled the door shut. That's all I did. I pulled it shut until the latch caught. And I tried the knob, and it was locked again, cold again, like it had been at the start of my shift. And I stood there with my hand on the cold knob, and the wet wool smell already thinning out of the hall. And I told myself the most useful lie I had, which was that the house had drafts and old doors, and that sound carries strange in stone buildings at night, and that I was a tired man who'd let a dead guy's notebook crawl into his head. I said it out loud, actually. I said, old house. Like naming the category would file the thing away inside it. Then I went back to the office and I sat down. And I looked at the visitor log open on its stand. At the 34 I'd written and the dash name party of 1 at 1:40. And I did something I want to be honest about. I didn't cross it out. I'd been told you don't cross things out, that crossing out doesn't unmake them. And some animal part of me had decided to believe that completely, the way you suddenly believe in a wet floor sign once you've fallen. But I also didn't leave it the way it was. I tore the corner of a sticky note and I wrote on it, very small, "This entry not witnessed DM." And I stuck it in the margin next to the dash, like a man covering himself. Like if anyone ever came asking, I could point and say, see, I flagged it. I knew I wasn't part of it. I put a paper trail between myself and the thing. That's the kind of courage I had. Administrative courage. I finished the shift. The writing didn't come back. The smell didn't come back. At 6, the gravel lit up, and Marv's truck rolled in, and I met him on the porch instead of in the office, which I'd never done. And I think he noticed, because he looked at me a beat too long, the used appliance look. He asked if it was a quiet night. I said, yeah, quiet. He went inside to check the logs, and I stood on the porch in the cold and waited. And through the sidelight I watched him stop at the visitor stand. He read the page. I watched him find the dash entry. I watched him find my little sticky note. And I watched him peel the sticky note off, read it, and put it in his jacket pocket without any expression at all, the way you pocket a receipt you don't need. And then he turned the page forward to a fresh one for the day, and he never said a word about it, not then, not later. I want you to sit with that, because I've had to. He didn't ask me what not witnessed meant. He didn't tell me I'd done it wrong. He didn't reassure me. A normal supervisor, finding a strange note from his night guy about a strange entry, asks a question. Marv pocketed it. He'd seen it before. He had a pocket for it. I drove home and I didn't sleep. I lay in the cold half of the duplex with the water heater ticking. And I did the arithmetic that actually mattered to me, which wasn't the visitor log, it was my own. Truck payment due in 9 days. Card minimum due in 6. Insurance split with my ex on the 1st. If I quit, I had what was in checking, which was not enough to cover the truck. And I had no second interview lined up because there were no second interviews to line up. That was the whole reason I was at Bellevon in the first place. I lay there, and I I weighed a sound in a stairwell against a repossession, and I'm telling you the repossession won. It just won. I'd like to dress it up, but that's the size of it. I decided the sound was a draft, and the smell was a draft, and the notebook was a sad man. And I would keep watching carefully, keep flagging things, keep my administrative distance, and ride it 2 more months. 2 months. That number became a thing I held on to. 8 more shifts a week. Call it 16 shifts, 17. And I'd be clear of the worst of it and could quit clean. The next night, I almost didn't go in. And then I went in. For about a week it was quiet, and quiet is how the place keeps you. The off totals stopped, or rather, the column matched what I totaled every night, because I matched it carefully, like I'd promised myself. No dash entries, no smell. The radiators knocked, the roof pinged, the windows flexed. I read another paperback. I started to feel, the way you do, that the worst was a stretch of bad nerves I'd come out the other side of. People can normalize almost anything if it stops happening for 6 days. That's not a flaw in people. That's just how a nervous system runs out of money. Then Pam left a note that wasn't about a radiator. It was on the pad by the phone, in a round, careful hand. But the flower at the end was smaller than usual, drawn fast. It said, "Hi, night shift. Sorry to dump this on you, but I need a favor. My nephew Tyler is going to come by some evening this week after I leave, just to drop off a casserole dish I left at his place. He'll only be a minute." I told him the gate code and to come to the side door by the carriage house. Please don't lock him out or send him off. He's a good kid, just got his license, he gets nervous. He'll be in a gray Civic. Thank you, I owe you. Pam. And then, under the small flower, in different ink, like she'd added it after rereading her own note. He'll come before midnight. I made sure he knows. Before midnight. I read that last line 3 or 4 times. Before midnight. She'd underlined midnight. A woman arranging a casserole dish handoff does not underline midnight unless somewhere in the back of her mind, in whatever she half knew about this place after years of working days at it. There was a rule about midnight she didn't want to say out loud, and didn't want her nephew to test. People who work somewhere a long time learn the shape of its dangers without ever being told. They develop superstitions they'd be embarrassed to explain. Pam had one about midnight, and she dressed it up as logistics, the way I dressed up my own fear as drafts. I wrote back, because what else do you do? Hi Pam, no problem. I'll watch for the gray Civic, side door's fine, I'll get him in and out quick. Dale. I drew the check mark. And I meant it. I want that on the record. I meant to do the small, kind thing. I'd liked Pam for weeks across a one-way correspondence, her cookies, her flowers, her radiator complaints. A nephew with a casserole dish was the most normal, human, daylight thing that had ever touched that job, and I was glad of it. I propped the side door rule open in my head as a thing I'd handle. He didn't come the first night, or the second. The third night was bad weather, the first real storm of that winter. Sleet coming down sideways, the kind of night the county road floods at the low spot by the creek. And the floodlights on the roof corners turned the sleet into long white needles. I figured no kid with a new license drives out a flooded county road in sleet to return a dish. I figured he'd wait for better weather. I did my rounds. I totaled the column, which matched. Around 11:40, the front door knocked. Not the side door, the front. The heavy oak one with the deadbolt thrown. I was in the office. The knock came 3 times, evenly spaced, polite. A person knock, not a wind knock. And my whole body went cold in a specific way because it was 11:40. And Marv's rule was about after midnight. And this was before. This was inside the safe window. This was the window Pam had underlined. Before midnight. Before midnight. So by every rule I'd been given, this was a knock I was allowed to answer. This was a kid with a casserole dish 20 minutes early. I went to the front. Through the side light glass, distorted by the old wavy panes and the sleet running down them, I could see a shape on the porch. A person, hood up against the weather, standing back from the door the way a nervous, polite kid stands, not crowding it. And down on the gravel, half lit by the floodlights, sleet hammering its roof, was a car. I couldn't tell you the make in that light and that weather. It was a small car. It could have been gray. It could have been a gray Civic. I had my hand on the deadbolt. I want you to understand how close I came. My fingers were on the brass knob of the thrown deadbolt, and I was turning it. And the shape on the porch lifted one hand, not a wave exactly, more like a person showing you they're harmless. Here's my hand. I'm just a kid. Let me in out of the sleet. And the floodlight caught the porch at the right angle for half a second. And I saw that the person on my porch was not wet. Sleet coming down sideways hard enough to needle the windows. And the figure standing in it for however long it took to knock 3 times and lift a hand. And the hood and the shoulders were dry. Not damp. Dry like they'd walked out of a closet. And the wet wool smell was coming under the door. Through the gap at the bottom, cold rain on a coat. Except the coat on my porch was dry. Which meant the smell wasn't coming from the porch at all. It was coming from inside the house. From behind me. From the direction of the back stairs door. And it had simply found the same gap of air I was standing in. I let go of the deadbolt. I stepped back. The knock came again. 3 times, exactly evenly spaced. The same intervals, the same weight. And I understood with a flat certainty I had no evidence for that if I opened the door, I would not be letting in what I saw. I would be agreeing that what I saw was a kid with a casserole. The same way writing 30 agreed that 30 children came. And that the agreeing was the whole mechanism, that the house didn't take anything. You didn't first write down or open up or count. That it needed a witness to make a thing real. And that a witness was exactly what a night attendant was for. I noted the time in the margin of the log. 11:43. I noted it because Marv told me to note it after midnight, and I noted it before midnight, breaking the rule by being early to follow it. And I didn't care. I just needed my hand to do something procedural, while the rest of me stood very still. I did not open the door. I did not call out. I went back to the office and I sat with my back to the wall so I could see the doorway, and I waited. And the knocking went on, 3 at a time, patient, until I watched the clock until 12:01, 1 minute past midnight, and then it stopped. It stopped at exactly the moment it became the thing the rule was about, as if it had been waiting all along for me to be allowed to answer. And once I wasn't allowed anymore, there was no point. That should have been the worst night. I keep wanting to tell it like that was the worst night. But the worst night was the one where Tyler actually came. Because here's the thing I didn't let myself think while I sat against that office wall. If that wasn't Tyler at the front door at 11:43, then somewhere out there, a real kid in a real gray Civic still had his aunt's casserole dish on the passenger seat and a plan to drive it out to the historic house some evening before midnight. And the storm broke the next day, and the county road dried out, and the weather turned clear and cold. And on a clear, cold Thursday, 2 nights later, at 11:15, the side door by the carriage house opened, and a real kid came in. I knew it was him the second I heard the side door, because it was the side door, the one Pam had arranged, the one the dry figure hadn't used. I came around through the back of the main floor, the route, even then, the rote, doubling me back the way the laminated card said, and there he was, in the little mudroom by the carriage house entrance, stamping his feet, holding a glass casserole dish wrapped in a grocery bag. A tall, thin kid with his aunt's same round face, maybe 17. A new licensed nervousness in how he stood. He said, "Hey, are you Dale?" My Aunt Pam said there'd be a Dale. And I felt, for one clean second, pure, ordinary relief. A kid, a dish, a name. The most normal thing in weeks. I said, "Yeah, I'm Dale. Come on in out of the cold. You must be Tyler." He grinned, relieved himself, and stepped further in. And that's when I smelled it. Wet wool, cold rain on a coat. On a clear, dry, cold night, off a kid who'd walked 20 feet from a dry car, the smell of someone soaked through and out in the weather a long time. It was coming off him, or it was coming toward him. I couldn't tell which. And that not being able to tell which is the part I still can't put down. I want to tell you I acted. I want to tell you I grabbed him by the arm and walked him straight back out the side door and stood there in the cold until his taillights were gone. Some version of me in a better story does that. What the actual me did was freeze for just a second, with my mouth open, trying to find a way to say something that wouldn't sound insane, and a second is all it took, because Tyler said, "Aunt Pam said just to leave it in the kitchen. She said you'd show me. It's like her good dish. She didn't want to leave it with me anymore." And he started walking on his own toward the interior of the house, toward the kitchen, which on the route is at the back, near the back stairs door. And God help me, I followed him instead of stopping him, because my whole training was the route and the rooms and not improvising. And because telling a polite teenager to turn around and run felt, in that second, more embarrassing than dangerous, more likely to get me fired and reported and blamed than to save anybody. And I was a man with a truck payment in 7 days. And somewhere under all of it, I still didn't actually believe. I still had drafts and old houses filed in front of the truth. And so, I followed a kid toward a kitchen instead of saving him. Because believing would have cost me more than I could afford. We got to the kitchen. It's original, big, a cold flagstone floor, a long scarred table, copper things hung on the wall that the day tours love. He set the dish on the table. He said something about how cool the house was, how he'd lived nearby his whole life and never been inside. And the backstairs door, which is right off the kitchen, the door I keep shut always, day or night. The door I had checked at the start of my shift and found locked and cold. The backstairs door was open. Wide this time, not 4 inches, all the way onto the black stairwell going down. And the wet wool smell was pouring up out of it now. And under it the copper and salt smell, the ambulance smell, thick enough to taste. Tyler looked at the open door. He's 17 and curious, and it's the one part of the house that's dark and unstaged and real-looking. And he said, "What's down there?" And he took a step toward it, the way a kid does, just to look, just to see. And I finally moved. I said, "Hey, no, that's not part of the..." And I got a hand on his shoulder. And the second I touched him, I heard, from down in the stairwell, the sound. The writing. The short stroke, the pause, the longer stroke. Filling in a form. Somebody down there knew the columns by heart. And I made my choice. I want to be exact about it because it's the choice the whole thing comes down to. I had 2 things I could do. I could pull Tyler back from the door and stand between him and the stairwell, and trust that whatever this was couldn't take a person who hadn't been written down, hadn't been counted, hadn't been agreed to. Because that was my whole theory. That it needed a witness. That nothing happened that wasn't first made real in the book. Or I could let go of his shoulder and step back and get myself out of the kitchen, away from the open door, away from the smell, and let the kid figure it out, and tell myself afterward that he'd wandered off on his own, that I'd warned him, that it wasn't my fault. Those were the two. Protect him with my body and my unproven theory, or protect myself and build the alibi. I let go of his shoulder. I'd love to tell you something interrupted me, that I tried and failed, that I was thrown back, that the house had me. None of that. My hand just opened, and I took a step back toward the kitchen doorway, the doorway out. And as I did it, I heard myself say, in a calm, helpful voice that I have hated ever since, "Yeah, go ahead and take a look. Just watch the bottom step. It's steep." I told him to take a look. I told a kid to go look down the dark stairs. I dressed up abandoning him as hospitality. And the awful thing, the thing the notebook guy understood, the thing every man in that chair understood, is that it worked on me too. Saying it out loud made it ordinary. Made it just a guy showing a visitor the house. And ordinary was so much cheaper than the truth. Tyler smiled at me, said thanks, and went down. I didn't watch. I went to the office. I sat at the desk. I put my hands flat on the cold wood, and I kept them there. I heard for a while the ordinary sounds of a kid on old stairs, a creak, a scuff, his voice saying, "Whoa," at something, the kind of sounds you'd hear from any teenager poking around a basement. And then I heard him say, in a different voice, smaller, "Hey, there's a guy down here. He's writing something." And then I heard nothing. Not a scream, not a struggle. The writing sound stopped, and the kid's voice stopped, and the house went back to its radiators and its roof. And the wet wool smell thinned out of the air over the next 20 minutes, the way it always did, like a thing exhaling. And I sat with my hands flat on the desk, and did not move, and did not go look, and did not call anyone, because there was no one to call. Because Marv didn't pick up at night. Nobody picked up at night. The notebook had told me that. And because some part of me had decided that if I didn't see it, it wasn't fully real yet, that I could still keep it on the safe side of witnessed. The casserole dish was still on the kitchen table. I saw it on my next round. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it. Pam's good glass dish in its grocery bag. And the backstairs door was shut again, latched. And when I made myself try the knob, it was locked and cold. And here is the thing that finally, completely broke whatever was left of my drafts and old houses explanation. The gray Civic was gone from the gravel lot. I went and checked, walked right out into the cold in my shirt sleeves, and stood under the floodlights. And the lot held my truck and nothing else. A kid had driven out, parked, come in the side door, gone down some stairs, and the car he came in had gone home without him. I never heard it start. There's only the one gravel drive, and the office faces it, and I'd have heard tires on gravel. It was just gone. The way the 30 canceled children were on the page and not in the world. The way the dash name party of one was in the book at 140. The car had been counted into the lot, and then it had been counted back out. And somewhere a record of a normal evening visit was being kept clean. And the only loose thing in the whole transaction was a glass dish on a table that nobody had thought to make disappear. I took the dish. I'm not proud of it, but I took it. I wrapped it back in its grocery bag, and I put it in my truck. Because leaving it there was a thing the day staff would find and ask about. And I couldn't have them asking about it. I needed there to be no question that connected Tyler to the house on a night I was the only one in it. I drove home in the gray light with a dead kid's aunt's casserole dish on the passenger seat where his hands had been. And I want you to understand, I was already on that drive before I'd even processed what I'd let happen, doing the thing the job had trained me to do. which was managing the record, removing the entry that didn't fit, making the page total clean. Pam's note was on the pad 2 mornings later. I'd been dreading it the way you dread a phone call you know is bad. It said, "Hi, night shift. Did Tyler ever come by? He's not answering his phone and his mom's worried. Said he told her he was running an errand for me Thursday and never came home. Please tell me you saw him. Please tell me he's okay. Did he come? Pam." No flower at all this time. I sat in the office with that note, and I did the worst thing I have ever done in my life, which doesn't look like much, which is the whole horror of it. I picked up the cheap trust pen and I wrote back, "Hi, Pam. No, he never showed here. I watched for the gray Civic all week and nobody came to the side door. Maybe he changed his mind about the dish. Hope he turns up, let me know. Dale." And I drew the check mark, the same little check mark I always drew, because not drawing it would have looked like something was wrong. And I needed everything to look like nothing was wrong. I told a frightened woman her nephew never came to the place where I watched him walk down a set of stairs and not come back. I made the page clean. I told myself a structure of reasons, the way you do. That nobody would believe the true version. That the true version would put me in a basement with a missing kid and no body and no explanation, and I'd be the one they'd look at. The broke night guy alone with a teenager who vanished. And they'd be right to look at me. Because in every way that a court would understand I was guilty, I'd let him go down there. I'd told him to take a look. That telling Pam the truth wouldn't bring Tyler back. It would just take her hope and replace it with a horror she couldn't act on either. That she was better off thinking he ran off. That lots of 17-year-olds run off. That she'd grieve a runaway easier than she'd survive the truth. I built that structure very fast and very solid because I needed somewhere to stand. But the foundation of it, the thing all the reasons rested on, wasn't any of those reasons. It was the truck payment. It was the card. It was the fact that I was a man with no cushion left, who had found a way to keep getting paid. And the way was to keep the page clean, and I kept it clean. After that, I expected to feel haunted, and I did. But not in the way the word means in stories. I felt it as nausea and bad sleep and an inability to look at the casserole dish, which I'd shoved into the back of a cabinet in the duplex and could not bring myself to wash or throw away. The horror, day to day, was administrative. It was checking the visitor log every night with my stomach in my throat to see if Tyler's name would appear in it. Party of one, some impossible time, the way the dash name had. It never did. I think because I'd never written him. I'd kept him off the page, and off the page he stayed. Which meant, and this is the logic the place taught me, the logic I now think in, that there was, in the book's terms, no record that he'd ever been real at all. The house had taken him, and I had erased the receipt. We'd done it together. That's the part Marv could never have explained to me on day one. The part the rule about totaling was actually for. The night attendant isn't there to count the visitors. He's there to decide which ones the record will admit happened, and which ones it won't. And either way, he's the witness that makes the decision stick. I'd thought the danger was being made into a number. The danger was being made into the one who writes them. Marv came by that week. He found me in the office and he didn't do his usual log check and leave. He sat down on the edge of the desk, which he'd never done, and he set a thermos cap of coffee down in front of me, his own coffee, not the canned stuff, and he said, "You had a Thursday." Not a question. I didn't answer. He nodded, like the non-answer was the answer. He said, "Pam's nephew." Still not a question. He looked at me with a used appliance look, but softer now, almost kind, the kindness of a man who's watched this happen to a row of men before me and feels something about it, even if he keeps doing it. He said, "You did right not to write them down. Some guys write them down, thinking it'll, I don't know, honor them. It doesn't. Writing them down just makes it official, makes there be questions, makes there be a thing the trust has to clean up. And the trust doesn't clean up gentle. You kept it off the page. That's the job. That's actually the job. The part nobody can tell you up front, because if they told you up front, you wouldn't take it." He drank some of his good coffee. He said, "It gets to be every guy his second month. The Thursday. It's like the place waits till you're in deep enough you can't afford to walk. And then it shows you what the job is. Yours came a little early. You're a quick study." I asked him, it was the only thing I could get out. I asked him what it was. "Down there. What's down there?" He was quiet a while. Then he said the only thing he ever said about it that I half believe. And it wasn't an explanation. It was a man telling you where the line is. He said, "I've worked this property 31 years. Started where you're sitting. I have never once opened that door. The guys who open that door, they're not the ones who quit. The quitters are the lucky ones. The ones it spooks before it owns. The ones who open the door, they don't quit. And they don't stay either. They just stop. Somewhere along the way, they stop being on one side of the writing. And they're on the other. And then there's a new dash in the book some night, and a new guy at the desk who flags it with a sticky note." He stood up. He capped his thermos. He said, "Don't open the door, Dale. Keep the page clean. Cash your checks. In a year you won't smell it anymore. Mostly." And he left. "In a year you won't smell it anymore. Mostly." That was the closest thing to comfort anyone offered me. And the awful thing is, it worked. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in months. It didn't pretend the thing wasn't real, and it didn't pretend I could fix it. It just told me how to live next to it, which is what I actually needed. Because by then, I had no intention of leaving, and we both knew it. He'd seen it in me on the porch the morning after the dry knock. I was a quick study. I'd already started keeping the page clean before anyone told me to. I stayed past 2 months. I told myself 2 months, and then it was 3. And the truck got paid off in the 3rd month. And I told myself I'd quit once the card was clear. And the card got under control in the 5th month. And by then, I'd stopped setting dates. The job, you have to understand, was easy. That's the thing nobody believes. Almost every night was nothing. Radiators, roof, paperbacks, weak coffee, a column that matched a total because I matched it. The Thursdays were rare. Weeks would go by ordinary and you'd start to feel almost normal. And then the smell would come, wet wool and cold rain. And the backstairs door would be open some amount of inches. And I learned to do exactly what Marv said, which was nothing. Note the time. Don't open it. Don't look. Don't write down whatever it brought. Keep the page clean. Cash the check. I got good at it. I got so good at it that I stopped flagging things with sticky notes, because flagging was its own kind of writing down, its own kind of making real. And the cleanest page is the one with nothing extra on it at all. Pam quit that spring. Her note on the pad just said she was retiring early, family reasons, take care, and the flower she drew was so small it was almost just a dot. They never found Tyler. There were flyers in town for a while. At the gas station, the gray Civic and the round face, last seen, a number to call. I bought my gas at a different station so I wouldn't have to look at it. A new day woman started, younger, named Brenda, who didn't leave cookies or draw flowers, just dry, efficient notes about radiators. And I was glad, because I couldn't have done the warm, one-way friendship again. Couldn't have liked someone across a notepad, knowing what the notepad was for. I'm still there. I want to be honest about that, because it's the part that makes this not a story about a haunted house. It's a story about a man who found out what the house was and kept showing up. I've worked Bellevon 4 years now. I'm the senior night guy. There's a second property. The trust expanded. And when they needed someone to train the night attendant out there, Marv being mostly retired, they asked me, and I said yes. And the rate was $2 an hour more, and I drove out one Thursday at 6 in the evening after the day staff left, because the man on the phone liked there to be a gap. And I stood in front of a new young guy who'd been out of work and couldn't afford questions. And I tapped the open visitor log on its stand, and I heard myself say, in a flat voice I'd gotten from somewhere, "You total what's on the page, not what you think should be there. If the page says a number, the number's real." He said, "Sure." He had a reasonable explanation ready before I'd finished. I could see him build it. I let him keep it, because telling him the truth up front would just mean he wouldn't take the job. And the job has to be taken. The chair can't sit empty. The gap has to be watched. I left him a fresh notebook in the bottom drawer, a spiral one, the kind you'd write grocery lists in. I don't know why I did that. Maybe so he'd have somewhere to put the thing when it gets to him his second month. Maybe so the next guy after him would find it. Maybe that's just how it gets passed down. One tired man leaving a notebook for the next, a warning none of us are willing to make loud enough to actually stop anybody, because stopping somebody would mean the chair sits empty. And none of us, not one, has ever been willing to be the one who lets the chair sit empty. Pam's casserole dish is still in the back of my cabinet. I've moved twice, and it's come with me both times, wrapped in the same grocery bag. I can't wash it, and I can't throw it out, none, because washing it would be cleaning up the last loose receipt, and throwing it out would be the same. And some superstition I've earned tells me that as long as one real object from that night exists, unprocessed, off the page, there's one thing in the world that didn't get made clean. One thing the book doesn't have. It's the only honest thing I've done about Tyler. It's not much. It's a dish in a cabinet. But it's not in the book. Last week, the new guy at the second property left his first note in the shared system, the dry kind, asking about a radiator. And under it, in the margin, in handwriting that was light and almost dry like a pen running out, was a second note that he hadn't written, and I hadn't written, and Brenda hadn't written, that just said, "Tell Dale the dish goes in the book too. Tyler, party of 1, 10:52. We're only waiting on the witness." There was a check mark drawn next to it. My check mark, the one I always draw. And I've been sitting here every night since, with the visitor log open in front of me and a cheap trust pen in my hand. And the page is still clean. I've kept it clean. 4 years I've kept it clean, but the radiators are knocking and the roof is pinging, and the wet wool smell came under the office door about an hour ago and hasn't left. And I keep telling myself I won't write it. I keep telling myself the page stays clean. And I keep noticing that my hand has drifted to the line where the 10:52 would go, and that I've already, without deciding to, drawn the little flower next to it that Pam used to draw, and that I don't remember picking up the pen